Well, I'm going to bring us back down to earth and to Washington, D.C., where the U.S. Congress backed an amendment which could force an investigation into allegations that the Pentagon weaponized insects like ticks in a secret program. Now, the co-chair of the House Lyme Disease Caucus asked hard questions about this program in a news release, including if these experiments caused Lyme disease to mutate and spread. Investigative journalist Ben Swann joins me to details. Ben, I know this, you read the headlines, you go, wait a minute, weaponizing bugs, what is this about? But for anybody who's ever had to deal with Lyme disease in their family, there's a very serious disease. But is it anything realistic to think that we buy a weaponized program, there is a bioweaponized program, and how it would involve bugs here in the United States?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. So I think that when this kind of first comes up, as you rightly point out, when you hear that the U.S. government might have been weaponizing ticks with Lyme disease, and essentially not just Lyme disease, by the way, but stuffing them full of all kinds of pathogens in order to use them for biological weaponization and biological warfare. It seems bizarre. So I started researching it more, and I actually have found all this was supposed to have come out of two particular laboratories, one of them at Fort Detrick, I believe it's pronounced, Fort Detrick, in Maryland. And what's interesting about that, Scotty, is Fort Detrick apparently has a long history of this and was set up during World War II as the kind of base for studying how to weaponize insects during World War II, during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War. And apparently they were doing a lot more than just loading up ticks with pathogens. Well,
and that's the thing. We started off the show talking about nukes and what was going on with oil and crisis, and now we're going to the bugs. But at the same time, they all kind of come in together because it's all about taking out your enemy. The question that makes this kind of raises the red flags is the fact that we need a congressional budget oversight approval to find out whether or not this was done and to the extent.
Yeah, that's right. And right now, the request is for the DOD's Inspector General to do a report, an investigation and report, and find out whether or not this is true. And apparently there have been rumors about this for years. In 1990, though, there was a speech that was made by a PhD at the University of Nebraska who details throughout history the use of biological weaponization of insects and other ways also. But he lays out this was in 1990, and one of the things that this PhD explains is that this particular fort that we're talking about, Fort Detrick, he says that by the 1950s, 1952 specifically, had begun work that they were accused of essentially sending infected rats and bugs into North Korea during the Korean War, and that diseases began to appear there that had not existed for 500 years in North Korea, and they began to appear during the Korean War. 10 years after those accusations were made by the Chinese, apparently in front of Congress, there were people from Fort Detrick saying that, yes, that the U.S. was leading the way on this. And I want to tell you, just read something to you real quick from this speech. He says that in the 50s, Fort Detrick labs were set up to breed 130 million yellow fever mosquitoes a month, infect them with yellow fever, and deliver them to the enemy via cluster bombs or from warheads in a Sargent missile. This was testimony that was made about what Fort Detrick was capable of in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, that's the thing, Ben. So there is some historical precedence for this type of conversation to be having, even if it takes congressional budget approval to have it. Now, the other threat, the other charge in all of this is that these ticks actually mutated, and the reason why we have Lyme disease even today we're dealing with, and some of these others, was because it came from this. Is there any sort of reasoning for this belief to back this sort of statement up?
Well, I think it's a reasonable question to be asked, right? We don't know the answer to it, but it's definitely a reasonable question because, again, look, anytime you start to mess around with this stuff, and which clearly our government was doing, and they had these labs, again, that were doing this in the 50s and 60s, and really into the early 70s. About 1972 was when a lot of these programs seem to have been discontinued. I think it is a fair question to ask because when you begin to not just work with, again, Lyme disease, which takes a long time to set in, by the way, it's a pretty ineffective weapon. But when you start trying to mix different kind of pathogens and to be carried by insects, of course it's going to mutate. It's never going to stay one way because it's not a direct science. It's all experimental. And so I think there are very legitimate questions to be asked. The real question will be, if it is found to be true, will there be consequences for it other than just another thing that happened in the past that no one really cares about anymore? Well, because as you said, about 400,000 people around this country every year get Lyme disease. It's a big deal.
And you bring up the point, consequences in this, because it goes, if we were doing this 50, 60 years ago, if there would seem to be no ethics, I don't even know if this is an ethical question, but if we were going to this extent, then it makes you question what has gone on since then and even currently in some of the developments of this. So in the end, I have to wonder, is this a waste of taxpayer dollars if they end up forming what government does best, forming some sort of review process and they bring in contractors? Is it a waste of taxpayer dollars to find out what happened then and if it has any linkage to what's going on in present day?
I don't think it's a waste. And the reason I don't think it's a waste is because I think it needs to be made public. I think we need to know more about what has happened in the past in order to understand what is happening in our future. If you don't look back and say, let's review what's taken place, let's get the evidence of that. Apparently, U.S. biological warfare during World War II, there is a 500-page report that's classified, but it's all detailed, specific to World War II. That's been detailed, and it's sitting, in the Pentagon, but it's classified. I think all of that needs to be declassified so that the public can know, because if we don't recognize what our government has been willing to do in the past, we cannot be honest about what our government is doing now or will do in the future.
And Ben, let me be the first to say, we've known each other now for about a year. You're the first one I know to call out government waste, government corruption, better use of funds. If you're saying it's worth $1, then I'm pretty sure it is. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.